You think 2020 was weird? You don't even know what weird is.
Glass ceilings falling on you, like the blessings of a choice when it's the only way. Last night I thought I saw you with a drink and friends. You said you go there every day. Then I hear you say wicked television screen, Rockefeller energy, politician guarantees, stupid corporate synergy, MSNBC jerks messing with the young Turks, yogi hippieography, sentence immortality, PhD without a gig, dirty broken drill leg, Bible basher, black barrel, bakers book a short sale, cause we're on a pill kick, handing down a pink slip, missionaries at the door, bleeding out of every pore, democratic fail safe, money gets you in the game, money gets you in the game, money gets you in the game, yeah!
1919 and 2020 seem to be parallel years. Double numbers, pandemic, political upheaval, racial tension. We're going to look at those parallels. But we're also going to look at something that has no parallel. The Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919. That sounds like a joke, right? One of those tragedy plus time equals comedy things. But it wasn't funny to the 21 people who died buried in molasses. Let's go back a little before we get to that. Late August 1918, two sailors from the naval barracks at Commonwealth Pier turned up in sickbay. These two guys were the beginning of the second wave of a strain of the flu that had been ravaging Europe since January. It was claiming more lives than the Great War, which was also raging at the same time. It's estimated that 3 to 6% of the population of the planet were taken out by the Spanish flu between 1918 and 1920. That's 50 million people worldwide. After those two sailors got sick, there were 100 new cases in Boston by the end of the week, and pretty soon it was moving through the military into the civilian population, largely thanks to what we would today call a super spreader event. It was a big parade in support of the military, where 4,000 troops marched through the city and a huge crowd of civilians cheered them on. 4,000 Bostonians had died by the end of the year. I had a hard time finding archived Boston newspapers talking about the pandemic, at least in the beginning, but I sure came across a lot talking about the Red Sox. Sports has always been the priority in Boston, and the Red Sox in particular, and they won the World Series that year. In the pictures from the World Series, the crowds and the players, none of them are wearing masks, but it was early then, you know, and the World Series concluded on the 2nd of September that year because of the war. But Babe Ruth apparently caught the flu not once, but twice, which I didn't even think you could do that. Boston implemented pretty tight lockdowns for about a month, and then on October 21st, everything reopened as if nothing had happened, and the health commissioner declared that the pandemic was over. He kept saying that until the middle of 1919, even though lots of people died. Lots of poor people died. Most people were pretty careful, though, until November. And in November, the war ended. So for Armistice Day, everybody partied. That triggered a massive surge. I'm not going to go any further down the road of the pandemic because everything that was happening then is all too familiar to us now. I mean, it's the same stuff. Just like today, there were people fighting against wearing masks. Just like today, the whole thing got really politicized, yada, yada, yada. It's basically the same thing. I'm putting this out there to set the stage for January 15th, 1919. That's the day, during a pandemic, just after a world war had ended, in the midst of tumultuous debates over prohibition and women's suffrage, in a time of huge racial tension around the country, just months before a massive police strike, that's the day that a tsunami of 2.3 million gallons of scalding molten molasses roared through the streets of Boston, killing 21 and injuring hundreds. You think 2020 was weird? You don't even know what weird is. Well, let's talk about molasses. It's a byproduct of sugar production. It's a thick, dark syrup that's basically the leftover once you boil down sugarcane or sugar beet. It's used in cooking, molasses cookies, sticky buns, even ham glaze. But molasses has other uses too. It can be fermented to make ethanol, which you've probably seen that word on gas pumps, but ethanol is also an ingredient in both liquor and munitions. Both of those, the bombs and the booze, contributed pretty heavily to what happened. Purity Distilling was a company that specialized in ethanol production. In 1915, at the start of World War I, or the Great War is what it was called then, they decided to build a huge holding tank right on the harbor to offload and store molasses brought in by ship. The person overseeing the construction was Arthur Gell. That's actor Michael McKean, but he played Arthur Gell on Drunk History. He's the treasurer of Purity Distilling. He had no experience, but the theory was that this was a container, not a building, so it didn't really need all that. The company was really in a hurry because there was a lot of money to be made from distilling molasses into ethanol to be used in munitions now that there was this war going on in Europe. So who better to supervise the building of the big tank than the money guy, right? Because that's what it was all about, was money. When it came time to test the tank, Gell put about 6 inches of water in it, and then he declared that it was sound. But the tank was never really right. It would groan every time it got filled, and molasses leaked out of the rivets. You would think that that would be a warning sign, and it was. Employees went to Gell many times, neighbors went to Gell many times, but the company's response was to paint the tank brown so that you couldn't see the leaks. That sounds a lot like things we hear now, right? Just if you don't see it, then it isn't real, right? Denial. If we don't give people COVID tests, then nobody has COVID. And little kids would run across the street and scoop it out of the streets with cups because it was leaking so much, but hey, tank's brown, so no leaks. Notice I said the kids were coming from across the street. All of this is happening right in the middle of a residential neighborhood full of Italian and Irish immigrant families. The war was over, but the urgency had switched to another use for molasses: liquor. Prohibition was pretty much a done deal. At that point, it had a 1-year timeline for implementation, so it was going to go into effect in 1920. The 18th Amendment banning alcohol, just by coincidence, was actually ratified the day after the molasses disaster. There was a lot of pressure, a lot of money at stake. Purity Distilling needs to process all this molasses, sell as much ethanol to liquor production companies as possible before booze gets banned. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck with all this molasses. January 15th, Boston got a break from the cold of January. The temperature rose to an unseasonable 40 degrees. The sun was shining. People were just happy to take in the day. More people than usual were out in the streets. It was the time of day when kids are on their way home from school for lunch. Workmen were taking their breaks. The firefighters in the station house were playing cards. There really wasn't much warning. It happened so fast, no one even had time to react. There was a rumble, a hiss, a groan, and then a 15-foot wave of syrup slamming its way down Commercial Street at 35 miles an hour, engulfing people, horses, vehicles, snapping the elevated train structure in half, and tossing buildings up in the air and throwing down just wood. Almost as fast as it happened, it receded. It left the streets full of waist-deep, thickening syrup and bodies, dead and alive, the living totally unable to free themselves. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, slow as molasses. Well, that's cold molasses. Those few degrees of extra temperature sped things up considerably, but as the evening came on and the temperature cooled, the molasses hardened, almost to a solid. It trapped the captives even more. In the Boston Post, they described the scene this way: here and there struggled a form. Whether it was animal or human being was impossible to tell. Only an upheaval, a thrashing about in the sticky mess, showed where any life was. Police, firefighters, sailors from the nearby Navy ships, they did the best they could to rescue people, but the molasses was like quicksand. I'm not going to go into like the why and the how it happened, the physics, the science of it. There's actually some great videos here on YouTube about that. The bottom line though, forget about the science. The reason it happened was greed. Greed is the reason. It backfired in this case because despite attempts to blame it on anarchists, I guess they had Antifa even then, right? Purity ended up paying out what was a massive amount of money over the incident. But 1919 was not over yet. In September of 1919, the Boston police strike happened. Police officers who were being paid less than pretty much anyone at the time and had to buy their own uniforms and guns on top of that, were trying to join a union. And the police commissioner was adamant that cops had no right to unionize. The officers refused to report to work for a few days, and during that time, the city went insane. Looters and criminals went nuts, chaos erupted, and the Massachusetts State Guard was brought in to forcibly restore order. In the process of that, they shot and killed 8 officers. The press called them deserters and Bolsheviks. Even when the guardsmen turned their machine guns on the crowd, the cops were the ones blamed for the unrest. The union they were trying to join, the AFL, even advised them to go back to work because labor was being set back. But when they tried to return to work, they found that they had been replaced with 1,500 new officers who were all making much higher wages than the strikers had ever dreamed of. I think you'd have to define that as an unsuccessful strike. I'm mainly sticking to Boston, but I can't talk about 1919 without mentioning that that was the year of the Red Summer, which was a period of white supremacist terrorism against Black Americans that took place in more than 36 cities across America. The whole situation, it's just not something I can really gloss over in a few minutes of a video. And anyway, I'm talking about Boston, but I couldn't skip it entirely when we're talking about this truly terrifying year. So why am I telling you all this? Because weirdly enough, I actually take some hope from it. You know, I think a lot of people feel like everything we're going through is so deep and so divisive and so life-changing that we're never going to get past it. A lot of people feel that way, but 1919 ended. It didn't get better by magic at midnight in 1920, but it ended. So the next time you want to pin everything on 2020, just remember that the last time we had a double number year, 1919, things were pretty bad. And be glad that you're not going to be here for 2121. By then, Americans will have forgotten all about the horrible year that was 2020. When I was researching this, a 2014 article in the Spanish flu said, conditions have changed in the century since World War I, making it unlikely the pandemic influenza disaster of 1918 to 1919 will ever be repeated. And yet, here we are. So that's my cheerful little story for today. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you like the history stuff, here's some more. Check that out. And I'll see you next time.